Welcome to Middleweight Politics Political Analysis for the Independent Voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally. My other half, Sean Griffiths, is out this week. And if you are tired of picking between the lesser of two evils and news presented in either red or blue, welcome home, because every week we discuss the structural issues driving dysfunction in Washington and what we can do to fix it. Now, on Middleweight Politics Political Analysis for the Independent Voter, we have hosted Democratic activists. We have had conservative thinkers. But you know what we haven't had on Middleweight Politics Political Analysis for the Independent Voter? Independent voters. Well, that changes today because my guest is Austen Campbell, former finance director for Nebraska Senate candidate Dan Osborne. You might remember Osborne was a union worker who ran as an independent and came within 6 points of unseating Republican incumbent Deb Fischer in a state Donald Trump won by 20 points. The race drew $43 million in spending and forced national Republicans to scramble, proving how vulnerable even safe seats can be when the right independent steps up. Now, Austen took everything he learned from working on Osborne's campaign and has founded the Independent National Coalition, a new organization looking to fund and empower independent candidates across the country to challenge the two-party stranglehold over government. In this episode, we talk about his experience working for the Osborne campaign, the challenges independent candidates face despite the high demand for them, and how his plan could tip the balance of power in Washington away from the parties and back to the voters. I hope you enjoy our conversation, but first, before we get started, I wanted to issue a quick PSA to our listeners. Now, Sean and I have been really encouraged by how many people we've reached with this podcast, but we also know that there are millions more out there. People who are frustrated with the two-party system, but who still believe that we can change things for the better. And this is where you come in. If you're a repeat listener, or if you like what you hear today, send this episode to one friend who's part of the exhausted majority, tired of the red versus blue food fight. Just one. That's how this movement grows. And while we're at it, here's something else. About 75% of our regular listeners haven't hit subscribe yet. And if that's you, please go ahead and click the subscribe button on your device right now. You'll never miss an episode, and it also helps more people like you find us. In exchange, Sean and I promise to keep bringing you political analysis through an independence lens and also provide information on practical ways we can push for real reform. Thanks for being part of the journey thus far, and now on to the show. I have never claimed to be a journalist. It's going to become glaringly apparent in this conversation because I am very psyched to speak with you, Austen. I'm very psyched to speak about what you're doing. Before we get into that, though, could you just introduce yourself and your organization to the listener?
Yeah, my name's Austen Campbell. I'm the founder of the Independent National Coalition. And our goal is to support independent candidates just like the DNC does for Democratic candidates and the RNC does for Republican candidates. I started this about a year and a half ago, and it's been an exciting journey so far.
When you and I first talked about this, I was on vacation in Florida with my family.
Correct.
I remember distinctly, I was sitting outside on the patio, tank top, my hair was all over the place. It looked like I sold weed for a living. And well, before it was legal, you know. And I remember you talking about this idea, and I was like, man, this guy has been reading my diary. Like, this is exactly what I feel is needed. And we're going to dive into that in a little bit. But first thing I want to do is kind of go all the way back. And can you just tell me, like, when did you start getting interested in politics? When did you start getting politically involved?
Yeah, certainly. Long story short of my background is, I've always had an inkling for politics, even going back to, middle school and high school, looking at what representing your community felt like. But I didn't really start to join, where I'm at today until about a year and a half ago, kind of late 2023, when it was coming up to the Joe Biden versus Donald Trump rematch. And it really dawned on me that the two-party system doesn't seem to be self-correcting. If the best America can offer was Donald Trump versus Joe Biden again, then something was clearly broken. And I started looking at alternative politics. I kind of viewed the politics of our parents as something of, arcane at this point, and we needed a revitalization for our generation. Because millennials, me being part of the younger millennial generation, we weren't politically active, and we still really aren't super politically active comparatively to, historical involvement of previous generations. So back in late 2023, I kind of started to dive into, what was alternative politics? Why hasn't it really taken off? Even though there seems to be this palpable drive for something new, no one seems to be really generating that option. So that's kind of really where I started to dive into it from there.
Well, first off, I mean, that was a rematch 70% of Americans said they didn't want to see from the outset. I'd actually be interested in your perspective a bit. So I'm Generation X. So I actually have a living memory of when the two-party system actually worked. So my political memory starts with Reagan, right? And Reagan wasn't without controversy, but they signed bills into law. Like government actually governed. I'm interested your perspective as, let's say, a late stage millennial. What's your perspective of American politics been?
So I can answer that in two ways. My perspective of American politics is my first real memory is 9/11. I was in fourth grade, and all of a sudden we went, middle school goes into lockdown in Boston because planes were hitting buildings. And that was a wake up call for a lot of people. And I think that's what really changed the trajectory of where we're at today. But the other way I could answer that is I think there are really three things that happened in America and American politics that really kind of started to get us to where we are now. And that was Newt Gingrich's defensive politics per se, never coordinate with the other side, always call them evil. They needed to beef up their numbers in the House of Representatives. Historically, Republicans never really had that. So the Newt Gingrich strategy back in the 1980s, then you get Citizens United, money in politics. And now you have a media cycle that is in a binary system that drives off of engagement, and engagement comes from negative incentives and sentiment. And that's what really drives this polarization. So, those kind of three things, government itself deciding that working together is not advantageous, money and politics driving the decision making, and then the distraction periods of media really being in that binary sense. That's where I kind of view politics as today.
Yeah, dude, you kind of grew up with a chain of like one-star Yelp reviews for American politics because I'll tell you, like, so I was always politically involved. Other people went out in the backyard and played ball with their dad. We watched Crossfire on CNN. Like that's like I was embedded in it. And we were diehard Republicans, Massachusetts Republicans. So, take that for what it's worth. But we were diehard Republicans. It was when you became politically aware that I started drifting away from the Republican Party
Yeah.
because I really saw this abandonment of fiscal conservatism. I saw this embrace of social conservatism, which I really didn't agree with. And I saw nobody represented me. And I wasn't going to be a Democrat either. And I think that prevailed until Trump. And then I became maybe a functional Democrat, but not an ideological one.
Yeah.
So let's kind of jump back to, we're going to go from 9/11. We're going to go
I love
all the
it.
way back to the present day. You got involved with Dan Osborne's campaign. And to set the stage, if you're unaware of who Dan Osborne is, he was an independent running for Senate in Nebraska against incumbent Republican Deb Fischer, came really close to the point where Republicans were worried they were going to lose Nebraska. So talk about how you got involved with them, what you did for that campaign, what the experience was like.
Yeah, it was fun. I mean, and this kind of ties back into my early journey at the late 2023 going into 2024. I started looking at alternative politics, who was running as someone that was outside the two-party system. And I think I initially stumbled upon Dan Osborne's campaign website in early May of 2024, and just his message resonated. I mean, my dad is a union mechanic, worked at the MBTA. Dan Osborne was a union mechanic. He worked at Kellogg's. it became this almost symbolism of, okay, well, those are the types of people that should really be representing a large swath of Americans versus, what we currently have today. So I started looking at his campaign more, and I had this philosophy back then of independence running alone. Yes, that's a pro, that's an advantageous stance outside the party system, but it's also a con. You're by yourself. You don't really have any sort of national identity that can really grow your movement, your voters, and eventually your donations to fuel your campaign. So I started reaching out to a bunch of independent candidates that were running. There was Shalane Etchinson out in North Carolina. There was Jared Young in Missouri. But the Dan Osborne race really stuck to me as something that was viable. So I luckily got a chance to have a conversation with them in July of 2024. And I have a background of working in finance, and then I worked in education technology. And I'm just a personable guy, so I offered my, volunteer. I said, I don't need to be paid. I can work remote. I was living in Texas at the time. So they brought me on as the deputy finance director, really to start to drive more of the organizational side of the fundraising apparatus. At the time, I think they had campaigned for like 12 or 13 months and had raised about $1 million. My job as the deputy finance director was to really start to build out an infrastructure of how we were to grow that. And I did a little bit there. It was fun to be part of engaging with donors that were typically partisan in their ideology. They typically just looked at politics as, am I donating left or am I donating right? In Nebraska, they're very similar to Maine, where their electoral college is split. So they have this blue dot. So they have this population that they need to balance their approach. When I got to the campaign, I ended up moving to Nebraska for about 3 months and then realized that they needed a lot more efforts in field. If you've ever worked on a campaign, like knocking on doors and having face-to-face conversations is really where you move the needle. So I transitioned to a lot of field work towards the end of the campaign, but it was fun to start to build the infrastructure of the fundraising apparatus. And then by the end of it, I mean, I think we ended up raising $8 million in the last 2 months of the election in total, with all the independent expenditures. Which, if you're unaware what that means, it's like outside money, PAC money, all the corruption to some degree, and what we think our politics is. But there was about $43 million spent in that Nebraska race. Where typically the initial analysis says if we had raised six, we would have won. So to your point, that's where the Republicans really started to worry that they were going to lose the seat in Nebraska, because it was such a race that went under the radar for so long, and Dan had such a compelling message against Deb Fischer that's what we're really trying to emulate as we go forward. But it was a fun campaign. It was my first campaign, and I'll always remember that as we didn't win, but it was definitely a victory for this movement.
100%. And again, just to emphasize, this was really close for a state like Nebraska and for a
Yeah.
candidate with virtually no experience.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump won the state by 20 points, and we only lost by 6 points. So, like,
Yeah.
I mean, it was something like we took, 20% of the Republican vote that voted Donald Trump, voted Pete Ricketts, but then voted Dan Osborne over the Republican incumbent Deb Fischer. And that goes to show you that, yeah, we definitely live in this partisan world of voters, but if you're not a good candidate, you don't just get the vote because you have a D or an R next to your name.
One of the things I want to jump back to is the role of door knocking, the
Mhm.
role of face-to-face conversations, because there's so much emphasis on fundraising and on money in politics. But you mentioned here that the face-to-face conversations are really where the needles moved.
Yeah.
What were those face-to-face conversations like, part one? And part two, I guess, why is there so much emphasis on maybe the more expensive parts of politicking? So like TV ads, things of that nature, given that field work is so much more effective.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question, and the answer is kind of complex.
Mhm.
I mean, at the end of the day in politics, the goal is to raise money in hopes that you can exchange it for a vote. Raise enough money to be able to get your message out there so that people can hear it, and they will listen, and it will feel like, you are the one that should represent them, and they vote for you. But media has such a, positive and negative spin, where the face-to-face conversations were amazing. I mean, we would go out there to the state fair, me and Dan. I mean, I did 15,000 miles in 3 months in Nebraska in my truck. So it's like, you got to hit the pavement. Nebraska's a big state too, so you're driving 4 hours here, and then 2 hours here, and then 2 hours here. And in the media strategy that the campaign manager came up with, which I thought was brilliant, was we should talk to everyone everywhere. So what we did is we drove to any small town that would have us in a bar, and there would be anywhere from 3 people to 80 people, convening because they heard that a Senate candidate was going to come to speak with them and hear out their concerns. So when we were out there, I mean, it was Democrats and Republicans filling the same room to hear Dan Osborne's speech, and sometimes it went great and sometimes it didn't go so great. But having those face-to-face conversations really allowed us to engage with the voters and get us, and for them to get a sense of who Dan was morally, and as just an authentic human wanting to speak with them and share his story and hear theirs.
Yeah.
But then there's the negative side, and why you have to raise money for the ads and the TV buys. When we did our cross state tour, I collected a lot of numbers, people that wanted to get involved, volunteer, have a big yard sign in their yard. And towards the end of the campaign, when the NRCC and Mitch McConnell spent, $6 million against us in attack ads, I'd have people texting me and be like, Austin, I can't vote for Dan knowing that he wants to give Social Security to illegal immigrants. And I'd be like, that's not real, though. Like, that is just a flyer taking quotations out of context to make it seem like Dan said that. Like, those are just attack ads. He has never once said that. So you have to fight that. If they can put that ad out, if they can send 1 million mailers out 3 times a week at the last, in the last weeks of the election, that's hard to fight. And that's where you need to have the money in the bank to be able to counter that, because it's not possible to speak to every voter face to face, although those are the most powerful conversations and the ability to get someone on your side. But those counter ads, those attack ads, it's not illegal to lie in politics. That's the crazy part. And that's where, there's an emphasis on you have to do both, because you have to be prepared, to counter those.
So how much of that PAC money that entered in was Republican versus Democratic? How much of the outside funding was defensive, so Republicans trying to defend Deb Fischer, versus Democrats potentially trying to boost Osborne? And
I mean, that's the crazy part about our politics today. There wasn't any defense of Deb Fischer. There was not a single ad that said Deb Fischer has done so many good things for you. That's why you should vote for her. That's the problem with politics, is nobody politics on hope anymore. Nobody politics on look at all the good things I do. They politic on fear. Democrat Dan is going to give illegal immigrants Social Security. Don't vote for Democrat Dan. Like, that was the Republican money spent. So it's hard, because it's not even about, Deb Fischer has toured the state and has done so many amazing things for you. It's Deb Fischer is a rubber stamp Republican. Vote for her because Dan is a demon Democrat. Like, but it's lies. That's kind of where our politics has gotten today, and that's where that polarization comes from, is because all political messaging now is fear.
I want to get back to this because I think this is going to play out as we start to talk about what you're looking to do now. One
Certainly.
thing I want to highlight, though, is how Osborne performed as an independent versus other Democrats. This is something we talked about in the podcast a month or so ago. If you look, there was a Democrat in Missouri, Lucas Kuntz, who kind of portrayed himself as this Fetterman-style centrist Democrat,
Yeah.
outperformed Harris by 2 points in the state. And Osborne outperformed Harris by 8 points. Again, not a Democrat, but running on almost the same exact platform. So I think there's a very strong negative brand to both parties that I think both parties capitalize on. I want to jump, I want to get into what you're doing, but I have one more question for you on
Please go for it.
Osborne. And this is going to seem like it has an obvious answer. Why do you think he lost?
I think if our race was run in the midterms, we would have won. I think the 2024 election cycle was so polarizing and was so fear driven that it paralyzed a lot of voters. At the end of the day, I mean, there was roughly like 300,000 voters in Nebraska that voted in 2022 that did not vote in 2024. Why do these people stay home? If this was, and this is where every race is the most consequential race of our lives, if this was such a consequential race, why did 300,000 people stay home? Why are we so, gung ho on de-incentivizing a vote because it makes it seems like, oh, it doesn't matter? I think Dan loses because at the end of the day, I mean, the MAGA brand was powerful in 2024. They didn't really have a vision for the future, although they portrayed that vision as we're going to change things for the better. And we had voters, kind of look at us when we were on the trail and say, Dan, I like you. You're moral, you're authentic. I truly think you represent me more than Deb Fisher might. However, I don't like Democrats more than I like you, and you are taking a seat away from the Republicans, which gives a chance for the Democrats to control Congress. Therefore, I cannot vote for you. So it becomes a thing of like, it's not necessarily even about policy or the people that you put on the campaign trail. We are conditioned to think of our vote in such this like partisan ideology that the other side is so bad, they're so evil, that we must hold strong, even though, like you said, both brands have such a negative connotation to them right now. They're both underwater, but we're conditioned to say, yeah, but we're better than they are. So I'm going to stick with them. And that becomes the problem.
On that point, exit polling from the presidential election showed that there were about the same number of voters who were voting against a candidate as voted for either one of them.
Yeah.
So the Trump's victory was composed of about 30% of registered voters who were actually behind him, behind the MAGA movement. And the remainder that made up his victory were people who were voting against Harris. And Harris's numbers break down almost in the reverse, where there's a larger chunk voting against Trump. So, and the other thing I'll say too is I asked that question knowing that Dan Osborne, first time candidate, political independent, no party backing, up against the establishment in a red state. It's not a big secret, but the negative partisanship is certainly another aspect. So let's get into what you're doing now.
Yeah.
Tell me about the strategy. Tell me about the goals.
The Independent National Coalition's goal is really to be able to support independent candidates and build the infrastructure, just like the DNC and the RNC has for their candidates. Now, what we're doing for 2026 is pretty audacious. It's never been done. It's never been attempted. It's something of a political moonshot, as I would hear Jon Stewart be asking for. Our thought process, knowing that voters looked at Dan Osborne and said, I like you, you're moral, you're authentic, and I think, you represent me more than anyone else would, but I can't vote for you because the other side. We took that and said, well, what could we give that voter? Well, we have to give that voter an opportunity to not believe or to believe in that we are not just giving the power to the other side. So our thought process is this. The two-party system is not a self-correcting system. Third parties are a problem because when somebody goes to register to vote and they don't check off the Democrat or the Republican box, it's really hard to get them to check on a different box, like the Forward Party. They're trying to revolutionize and modernize what a third party could look like, but it's not really gaining traction. Independents by themselves have a pro, but there's no national unity. There's no real, well, you're just one person. What are you going to do in Congress? So our thought process is this. If we were to run a balanced campaign, and what I mean by that is our goal is to run 50 independents across the country for the House of Representatives, running 25 against Democrats and 25 against Republicans. Our goal would be to deny both political parties a majority. Now, why is that relevant? Why is that important? Well, for if you understand legislative, the legislative process, it's the Speaker of the House that really controls, what bills, what legislation comes to the floor. And typically, if one party's in power, only their bills will come to the floor because a win for the other side is a loss for them. If the Republicans are in power, but the Democrats put up a bill that actually help America, they get the credit, not the Republicans. And it's this tit for tat battle. But if we were to deny both political parties the majority and get an independent to be the Speaker of the House, now we have a coalition government. We have an independent speaker that is basing the legislative process off merit and not necessarily just partisan drive. We can start to solve some problems: anti-corruptions, ethical reform. I mean, no one believes that Congress should be able to vote, trade in individual stocks, but they're not going to correct it themselves. So why we're doing this now is a lot of it is based off symbolism. 2026 is going to be the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So we could declare our independence from the two-party system. It's gotten to this point where the two-party system is not really working for our generation. And I don't know if I trust the 77-year-olds in office to legislate on AI and its impact on the workforce. This is the third oldest Congress we've ever elected. So it becomes this point where we, as the generations that are going to be taking over power from the boomers, the Gen X's, the millennials, we need to start to think about the next 40 or 50 years and how we want to reinvent America. And I don't know if that can be done within the party system because it's right now controlled by the donors and the elites that don't want it to change.
So I want to dig into that a little more, because really
Yeah.
what appealed to me, and the reason I was so enthusiastic about this idea, is that it answers the question: is this candidate just going to tilt X district or tilt the House in favor of the Republicans or the Democrats? Number one. Number two, it creates this body that can sort of be the negotiating force in the House when it comes to legislation. So
Yep.
ultimately, widely popular legislation can pass regardless of which party's standing against it. One question I have for you is, how do you keep ideological cohesion? Because, and I'll qualify that question. So when you talk about independence, a lot of times, and this is something we talk about on this podcast a lot, they're projected as this, either this moderate middle, or they're projected as this sort of ideological cohesive group, but they're actually all over the place. And so an independent candidate could mean a bunch of different things. I
Yep.
mean, RFK Jr. was an independent candidate. And so I guess my question for you is, let's just say those 50 representatives get elected. You just run the table, right? You've got a full 50 in the House. How do you keep them from all splintering off and kind of picking sides and due to their own self-interest?
I mean, I think the short answer to that, and I'll expand on it, is that's what democracy is. The fact that we think our politicians should be fit into a tidy little box, that all we know that they will always vote within this block, isn't cooperation. That isn't what democracy was supposed to be. We didn't say, okay, these 20 districts always have to vote together or else they're not considered a state. Like, no, you want representatives that vote on behalf of your moral and ethical values and bring support back to your district. I mean, that is the goal of a legislator. It's not to say my legislator is going to agree with me on every sort of issue out, under the sun. or else I can't vote for them. There needs to be deliberation, conversations, and then the ability to come to some sort of common ground. So I agree with you. I think independents have been, pigeonholed as this moderate center, but they're not. There are independents that are in every party, left, right, extreme right. There were 51 million Americans that voted in this past election cycle that were not party affiliated. Those are not all moderate ideological, center people. Those are people all over the spectrum that just says, I'm a progressive, but I'm not a Democrat, or I'm a conservative, but I'm not MAGA. That is the independent spectrum right now. So your question of how do we keep them, built into this cohesion? Well, for what? For what policies? For what purpose? On gun rights, if you're right of center and you're a Second Amendment advocate, stay over there. If you're left of center and you want gun reform, stay over there. Come to a compromise. But where we want our independence to hold firm and to hold the quote unquote center is on economic reforms that we need. Part of our platform is to say, the term is the fulcrum caucus. It's a political theory that says if you deny both political parties the majority, you become the lever, that fulcrum that can start to decide or weigh, one way or the other for reforms. Where we want our independence to hold that is on a national economic standpoint that says, Dan, you and I, we pay a progressive income tax, where the more money we make, the more money we pay in taxes. Why do corporations pay a flat tax, where the small mom and pop shop pays the same corporate tax as, Walmart or Amazon? That doesn't make sense to me. So what if we were to do some sort of corporate progressive tax where the first $1 million that you make in profit is only taxed at 5%? Well, that's going to help a small and medium business that only, generates 400,000, 500,000 in profit a year, because we're overburdening them with having them increase minimum wage, having them, deal with the health insurance costs for their employees. But as you tier up, let's say a company making over $1 trillion in profit, they might be paying 60, 70% on that tier. But we capitulate to them and say, well, we know you're going to want tax breaks, and we know you want to keep as much profit as you desire. So if your lowest income earner to CEO pay ratio is less than 100 to 1, tax break. If, let's say, you're, less than 5% of your employment or your employers are on government subsidized programs, tax breaks. This is a type of economic model that solves two of our major problems: wealth inequality, as well as a bloated government programs, social benefit programs, food stamps, housing assistance, and all that. Because it seems to be that out of the three pillars of American society, the working class, the political class, and the corporate class has figured out a way to buy the political class at the expense of the working class. The incentives have changed for corporations to take care of their shareholders, not their stakeholders. It's the government's responsibility to balance that back. We need to start to change the incentives for our corporations and our corporate class to invest back into and buy back into America and the American people and the American stakeholders. So this is a type of economic policy that an independent in Massachusetts could run on, as well as an independent in Arkansas or Florida or Nebraska, without being pigeonholed as like a socialist or a communist. Because we're not saying, let's take over corporations and make sure that they are distributing wealth. Yeah, they earned it. It's a capitalist society. If they earned it, they should try to keep as much of it as possible. It's the incentives of the system that we need to change. Now, that allows independents to run on a national ideology, a national fiscal policy. But we want our independents to run on local constituency issues. We want a right of center running in Nebraska to think about the moral values of their constituents, just as well as we want a left of center in Massachusetts to think about their constituents' moral values when they go to legislate in Congress. That's not what we're trying to hold. We're not trying to be purple. We're just trying to say that in a two-party system, we get what we have right now. hyperpartisanship, no problem solving, in this ever divisiveness that is not going to benefit America over the next 20, 40, 50 years. That's where we're losing this battle. And that's where independence can really, like you had said, kind of be the arbiter of these conversations. And that's why when
Yeah.
you and your friends are deciding on which restaurant to choose or who goes first, you don't do best of two with rock, paper, scissors. You do best of three. That's why there's three versions of government. It's an odd number. You need an odd number to start to balance off, what direction we need to take.
Yeah, I'm laughing because in my family, so I have 4 kids, and I mean, you think Congress is contentious? Just look at us when we're trying to figure out where to eat. But I'm not kidding. I use ranked choice voting
Yeah.
I use ranked choice voting to help determine exactly where we're going to eat. Give me your top 3, and then whichever one makes the majority list wins. But I think that the interesting thing, and I want to tie a thread here with some other stuff we've talked about on this podcast before, because one of the themes that keeps coming up is that what you would consider democratic economic policies, those being policies that are really designed to help out the working class, are very popular. So any policy that can balance out the power between the corporate class and the working class, extremely popular. Where the Democrats lose is on 2 things. Number one, cultural messaging, which turns off a lot of folks, and just brand. Just people don't trust them to get this done. So I think what is really interesting about this economic platform, and you can disagree with me if you feel I'm mischaracterizing it, but I feel like this is the type of thing that I think the Democrats have tried to hold the mantle on and have just lost whatever, the moral high ground, the credibility, whatever you want to call it. They've lost that, but people still thirst for it.
Yeah.
And that's what really excites me about, what you're
Yeah,
doing.
I'm going to push back a little bit
Sure.
because this is where I think, and maybe it's just a branding problem for them. Um, their solution right now stems to the message of tax the rich, give it to the government will help the people. And they point back to the days where, you know, the tax rate was upwards to 70, 80, 90% on the rich. But where I think they're failing to recognize is that it wasn't the government back in those days that did anything necessarily. The rich decided, well, I could either give 90% of my income to the government or I could be philanthropic with it and decide the effectiveness of it myself. So it wasn't that the Rockefellers decided to give the money over to the government. The government built all these libraries and museums and infrastructure and whatnot. It was the corporations that bought back into America and said, you know what? I'd rather build the building and put my name on it than give it to the government to decide how to deal with it. And that's where I think the Democratic message lose is they think giving the money to the government for the government to spend more is the solution. No, we already spend too much. The government needs to figure out how to reduce spending. That is where I think people bought into this MAGA populism, this American first populism, because they're right on some degree of we need to figure out how to spend less from a government standpoint. And that is getting corporations to change their incentives. We want corporations to make as much money as possible. We want American corporations to dominate to some degree, the global economic world. We want to be the innovators and the advancers of, values and technologies in the world. But we need them to also buy back into the American people and stop this neoliberalism of, well, let's make sure that our shareholders get as much value as they can, as well as us getting the cheapest labor as possible by exploiting other countries' markets. And this is kind of what's getting exposed by these terrorists right now. All these corporations that are saying, "Oh, we're making our handbags over here." No, China's like, "No, you literally make your handbags over here. We make 90% of it. We ship it over to you in Italy or France. You slap a Gucci logo on it and then 1000x the price and say, "Oh, well, if we were to make it in France, the price would go up." No, your profit margins would just go down. And you have to be okay with that. You can still make money and make profits, but also buy back into your people. I look at like Meta and Facebook. They had like a $60 billion profit margin, but then also laid off 15% of their staff. There was no business owner back in the 50s and 60s that would have done that. They would have said, oh, we are profitable. Here's Christmas bonus checks. We don't see that anymore.
Yeah, and this kind of speaks to something you said earlier, which is we have the third oldest Congress in history. And I'm guessing the second was probably the last Congress, and the first was probably the Congress before that, or somewhere around there, right?
It's somewhere around there, man. It's
Y-
crazy.
yeah, yeah, and and things have changed to such a degree that the world that these folks think exists, or the world that exists when these folks came into adulthood, is gone, entirely gone. And there are
Yeah.
also some huge challenges we're going to have to deal with as a society going forward. I mean, AI alone is going to do a lot to reduce the power that labor has from an economic sense. I think even when they talk about reshoring American manufacturing, a lot of people predict it's just going to result in more automation. Only 13% of manufacturing jobs lost in this country were due to global trade. The
Yeah.
rest were automation. And so I do think there has to be maybe a rewriting of the social contract, so to speak.
And that's exactly what it is. It's we
Yeah.
need a new American social contract
Yeah.
with those three pillars. The working class, the political class, and the corporate class need to come together and redefine what a social contract for America needs to be. I mean, yeah, our politics are in very short cycles, 2 year, 4 year cycles. We need to start thinking about American prosperity over the next 50 years. Like, yeah, it's our 250th anniversary coming up, but what does America 2050 look like? What does the next 25 years look like for us? That's what we need to start thinking about, because we have problems that are going to be burdened and shouldered by us. You, me, and our children are going to have to deal with that economic, pile of poo that they left us.
Yep, pile of poo. That's a very polite way of phrasing it, Austin. So tell me a little bit about your criteria for candidates. How are you picking your battles, and how are you picking the
Yeah,
candidates?
great question. So we started off when we looked at an analysis of the 435 incumbents. We knew that there was a generational turn coming. The younger generations are getting more active, the older generations are showing their cards. So we initially started our analysis on what we called our kind of trifecta analysis. If you are over the age of 65 as an incumbent, if you have more than $1 million net worth, and if you've been in office for more than 18 years. This is our kind of too old, too rich, too long mantra. This is the third oldest Congress we've ever elected, just like you said. So if you're too old, we need to get some 35-year-olds in office. We need to get some 40-year-olds in office. Let's have the youngest Congress we've ever elected in 2018. Let's start there. Congress is corrupt. They take a bunch of money. Less than 1% of Americans are millionaires. 50% of Congress are millionaires. That's absurd. That's not a representation of the working class. So let's start getting some people who want to build economic prosperity and not already have it and are trying to maintain it. That's kind of where we want to go there. And then term limits. That's something that most Americans agree with. I think it's like 86% of Americans, want to see some sort of move towards term limits, because these senators been in office for 30 years, you're not clearly being effective. It's not a thing. So that started us with the ability to delineate from 435 incumbents down to 143. Then we did further district analysis on those incumbents districts. What races give us the highest propensity to elect an independent? What's the voter demographic? What is the chances that we're going to run a two-way race versus a three-way race? How much money was spent on that last election? Because we know that the two-party system, they're going to outraise us, they're going to outspend us, they're going to punch us in the face over and over and over again with every legal challenge that they can find in the book, because they don't want to lose power. I mean, you even look at David Hogg, vice chair of the DNC, has pledged $20 million from his organization, The Leaders We Deserve, to primary older Democrats. And now the DNC chair is saying, oh, here's an ultimatum: don't primary our older incumbents or leave. And it's like, really? You guys are still holding on to this like corporate entrenched power that like clearly you lost in the last election? What are we doing here? So that's kind of where we started to delineate. We've gotten to the point where we've identified 80 different districts in 11 different states that we're going to target. Now that's balanced. It's 40 Democratic districts and 40 Republican districts that we want to run against, because we want this to be balanced. We want the voter and we want our candidates to be able to say, you're not voting for me as an independent because I don't fit your moral values. You're not voting for me as independent with the fear of giving the other side the gavel. You're voting for me as an independent because you don't like the status quo. You recognize that the two-party system is not self-correcting and we need to try something different. And me and the other 50 independents that are running across this country will be able to bring the voice of the working class and a voice of a generational turn to Washington that we so desperately need. And from there, we've got some goals: anti-corruption, economic realignment, building more towards a 21st century democracy. But this is just the start. If we can elect out of those 50, 7 or 10 or 15 independents, we can start to give voters a picture of what is beyond the two-party system. I almost view it as like we are storming the beach of Normandy's with our independence. Election reform can secure the beachhead from there. That's when we start to give voters, ranked choice voting, open primaries. And we can work towards the 2028 and the 2030 election to start going after state houses, getting more independents elected there, so that we can break down gerrymandering in this like absolute entrenchment of the two-party power that has really built a lot of these guardrails for any sort of political innovation to happen. And that's kind of our criteria right now.
Got it. So I'm going to build on the Normandy analogy because I
Go
really
for
like
it.
it. So you're storming the beach and you've got the two-party system up in their machine gun nests. And I'm pretty sure one of the biggest bullets they're going to fire at you is this idea of you're going to spoil the House for the Democrats. You're going to spoil the House for the Republicans. The whole Democrat Dan thing you experienced with Dan Osborne's campaign. Do you still see that as a potential obstacle
Oh
as you
no,
go into
we
midterms?
have taken we are taking that mantra and wearing it as a badge of honor. Hell yeah, we're spoiling the vote for both of you. Because you've had the last 180 years to do something. You definitely effed up the last 40 years. So, yeah, we're spoiling the vote, but not for one side or the other, but for both of you. And that needs to be the political innovation that needs to happen. Because the party system right now, both parties are in the hole when it comes to popularity. The Democrats and the Republicans have such an unfavorable name recognition right now, that why should Americans believe that you are the answer? And this is, yeah, they're going to throw that at us. I mean, Republicans are never going to try to lose power. So they're just going to try to call us a Democratic initiative to fight them. The Democrats are going to say, if you vote for an independent, you're going to spoil the vote, and Trump and the Republicans are going to stay in power. But like, what plane of logic says that you guys are the answers anymore? I don't believe it. And when I were to, if I were to speak to like a David Hogg or an Adam Kinzinger, or someone that's like, I see changing the party from within the most beneficial pathway, I would say, would your moral values or your ethical alignment change if you were a Democrat or an independent? If the answer is no, then why do you think the Democrats are still the answer? Why do you think the Republicans are still the answer? If your character and your values wouldn't change based on your political affiliation, why continue to do the same thing over and over again?
Last question for the person hearing this who just buys into this idea and wants to help. What are some of the things you need help with? How can people get involved? How can people take action?
right now we're at a point where we've identified our states, identified our districts, and we know where we want to target. So from then it's recruiting candidates that are moral and that actually, represent their communities. So if you become a voter or a supporter that's not in one of those districts that we're going to target, that doesn't mean that your support isn't vital. The way we're looking at 2025 is that there was 51.7 million Americans that voted, were active voters in the last election cycle, that did not check the Democrat or the Republican box. They have self-identified as someone that sees the two-party system not working. That's our audience right now. If you're one of those 51 million Americans that see something needs to be changed, go to the website independentnationalcoalition.com and pledge your vote. I had said earlier in this podcast that in politics, the whole goal is to raise money in hope to exchanging it for your vote. It would be much cheaper for us to just get your pledge of your vote. Buy into this idea of political innovation. And then as we grow this, start to figure out how we can get you involved, whether that's volunteering, phone banking. If you have the fiscal ability to donate, I ideally would rather 1 million people donating $1 a month than one person giving me $1 million a month. This needs to be grassroots. This needs to come from you, the listener, someone that wants to get involved, someone that wants to recruit these candidates to be your representation, because then we're going to need campaign staff. I mean, at the end of the day, running 50 campaigns is going to be challenging. That means 50 campaign managers, 50 comms directors, 50 fundraising directors, 50 field directors, and then the numerous amounts of people that need to be involved in a campaign. So get involved, pledge your vote, put your information into the website so we can contact you. And then as we start to really hose out, and start to share with the public a little bit more about our campaign, get involved. We know that the two-party system is going to, like I said, punch us in the face over and over and over again. So we don't really want to give them exactly where we're targeting early on so that they can shore up their defenses and build more, machine gun nests, if we go back to the World War II analogy. We kind of need to be secretive about this to some degree. We need to have a scalpel approach. But then when 2026 comes, we need to be a megaphone. We need to be unified with 51 million voices saying, we don't agree. We no longer consent to the rule of a two-party system, and we want to declare our independence from this political system that the politics of our parents have invented, that no longer represent our generation and no longer represent a vision for Americans' future that we buy into. So we are changing it. And that is the revolution that we need.
I love it. So again, if you want to get involved, we're going to include a link in the show notes to the website. Sign up. And Austen, first off, thanks for coming on.
Of course, Dan.
Number two, I want you back. I want updates. I want to know what's going on. I really want to do. I think Sean and I'll speak for Sean, even though he's not here. I think we both want to make sure that this is an organization that we support, and we continue to get the word out.
I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I could do this for hours. So if we ever want to do this again, just let me know.
You got it, man. You got it. Thank you for listening. And as I mentioned at the top of the episode, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to hit subscribe and share this with one friend you think might like it too. This is how we get the word out. The music you are hearing is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.